these as well. So without further ado, my name is Alex with Namely. We are here today with Hired, and today we're going to be chatting about how to remove bias from your hiring process. A really important topic to chat about in the talent acquisition process. So before we jump into the content and introduce the speakers, I want to highlight a few upcoming local events. At Namely, we are doing HR Redefined, which is an event in New York City. It's our second year of the event in June in New York City. Take a look at the information. We have Adam Grant speaking at hrredefined.namely.com. I believe there might be tickets left, a couple of them. So take a look. If you can't grab the URL, we'll send it out afterwards. And next, Hired has an in-person event too called Impact the Gap, a panel discussion and networking live in Seattle, Washington on June 13th. Snap a screenshot of the URL if you want to check out what they're going to be chatting about in Seattle in a couple weeks. So what are we going to chat about today? We've got 4 quick agenda items just to give you a high-level overview of what we'll discuss. The first covering what is unconscious bias. It's being talked a lot about in today's workplace environment. So we'll kind of go over a high-level definition. We'll chat about how bias can come up in the interview process, and additionally in the workplace when it comes to salary and the offer stage. So lastly, I think a really important section of today's webinar for you to get some valuable takeaways is how to empower employees to combat this unconscious bias. So with that, we've got a few people who are talking about this every day. They've trained me on it, honestly. So I think I want to introduce Nidhi from Hired, Maya and Ellen from the Namely team. Welcome all.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everybody. My name is Nidhi Gupta. I'm the Senior Vice President of Technology at Hired. Hired is a marketplace that matches tech talent with the world's most innovative companies. I currently lead our engineering, product, and digital marketing teams. I'm an engineer by training. I have my undergrad and my master's in engineering. Through the course of my career, I've grown up in this tech industry. Through the course of my career, I've hired over 300 engineers. Being an engineer and a hiring manager in this industry, I have experienced bias in recruiting firsthand. I've seen others go through it. Today, I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to share some of the tips and tricks I've learned along the way that have helped me and my organizations overcome bias.
Hi, my name is Maya Takarabe, and I'm an associate recruiter at Namely. We're a leading HR platform for HR, payroll, and employee benefits for mid-sized companies. I'm coming up close to my 2-year anniversary at Namely, so as one of the early members of the talent acquisition team here, I was part of the building out recruiting processes and scaling the talent acquisition function throughout a really critical period of growth. More so recently, I've co-led our interviewer training certification program, and so I'm really excited to share more about that with you today.
Great. And I'm Ellen. I'm the recruiting coordinator aligned to the tech org at Namely. In my role, I help source top tech talent across engineering, product, and design. And like Maya said, I helped co-lead an interviewer training that helped train everyone at Namely on unconscious bias. So I'm obviously really excited to be here as well.
Great. So let's jump right in.
Great, and I'll kick it off. So to start, we have a quick poll for you all to help get a sense of how familiar each of you are with unconscious bias. So is unconscious bias a hot topic and actively addressed at your company? And I'll give you a couple seconds to answer. All right, so it seems like half of you about 60% say that it's somewhat of a hot topic and that HR understands the issue but are not yet training all hiring managers on bias, which I guess is why you're here. So welcome. So before we can even start to, think about removing unconscious bias from the hiring process, it's important that we understand what unconscious bias even is. And more importantly, it's critical that all employees at your company understand what it is. And when you start to research unconscious bias, there's really an overwhelming number of definitions. And so when Maya and I first set out to build out unconscious bias training, we wanted to find the most clear definition that wasn't very complicated for this very abstract idea. And the one that stuck with us was one from Greenhouse, and it states that unconscious bias is the brain's tendency to take mental shortcuts, relying on observed patterns to quickly and subconsciously process information. And so what's important to call out here is that those observed patterns your brain subconsciously relies on may actually include cultural stereotypes or prejudice towards one group. And so even if we don't realize it, they're being pulled into the decisions that we make every single day. And to put that into perspective, we want to share exactly how rampant unconscious bias can be. And so I want you to pause and ask yourself how many decisions you've actually made today. And if you're an average human, I bet you can't do it. And the reason for that is because we receive 11 million bits of information every single day, yet we actually only consciously process about 40 bits of information. And so what that means is that 99.9% of the decisions that you make are unconscious, which in turn means that 99.9% of the decisions that you make are subject to this unconscious bias. And obviously with unconscious bias potentially seeping into 99.9% of our decisions, it's important that we create an awareness of unconscious bias as a whole. But even more than that, when we're working towards dismantling homogenous company cultures to build diverse and inclusive companies, we also need to create an awareness of what our own personal biases are, just because unconscious bias is such a subjective problem. And more often than not, it leads us to want to hire people who are similar to ourselves, so people who share similar values or backgrounds. And Maya's actually going to go a little bit deeper on the next slide on specific types of biases that you should be aware of and ones that come up in the hiring process.
Perfect. Thanks, Ellen. So I'd like to preface by saying that the 4 biases that are listed up here are not all the different types of unconscious bias. If you were to do a Google search, you'll get a whole list of them. But these are the ones that we focus on specifically. So the first 3, gender, racial, and school biases. I'm sure you're familiar with all these, and they're pretty self-explanatory, but they fit in the category of a stereotype bias. So say if the candidate is a member of a particular gender or racial group that is esteemed in a positive or negative way, we'll make unconscious decisions about their candidacy based on those preconceptions. Likewise, if they have or haven't gone to an elite university, we're more likely to perceive them as more or less capable candidates. And these are biases that have been built over time due to societal impacts of our history and how people have been divided into groups due to their socioeconomic backgrounds. And naturally, the majority of these people have persisted in those groups and can continue to perpetuate the disparity of diverse groups if they don't actively fight their unconscious bias towards those certain groups. So the one that we really want to focus on is affinity bias, which is the last one, as that seeps throughout many of the other biases. At Namely, we've internally coined this as the beer bias because we saw it come up so frequently in our early days. And this is really the idea that the candidate is deemed to be a good fit for your team or company culture because they are likable and you can get along with them. So people frequently think, or they'll say things like, oh, can I get a beer with them or can I go get drinks with them? And if so, that means they'll be a good fit in the role. But really this only shows that you can be really good friends with a candidate. It's not an objective evaluation of their skills and potential for success on the job. So in terms of the actual bias in the interview process, a really great way to eliminate subjectivity and unconscious bias is by using a system or tool that specializes in structured interviewing and allows interview team members to submit interview feedback. A few other reasons why feedback is important is that, one, there's consistent evaluation of all candidates, regardless of whether they are external, referral, or internal applicants. All candidates are treated equally and fairly. So namely, there's no special treatment for referrals. Everyone is treated the same. And then there's also data, right? You'll be able to better understand your hiring effectiveness. Say if you've had a mishire or hire's gone wrong, you can actually look back into the feedback that helped you make the decision to hire the candidate and make it a practice to reassess how you're consistently evaluating those candidates. And then third, documentation for better record keeping. Interviewers should be taking notes on interviews and submitting the feedback quickly instead of relying on memory. since you only really remember 30 to 40% of what you hear. So if you have a system that you can document things for record, you have a reliable source of information that you can always refer back to instead of basing things off of what people think they just said. And then lastly, there are legal issues that you can avoid with proper documentation, and you can be better prepared to act in situations where there is cause for legal action. So I guess I'll pause here and do a quick poll as well. And so, yes, how does your team submit interview feedback? I'll give you a few seconds to answer. Awesome. So it seems like it's somewhat, well, the highest is ATS, which is great. And it seems like we have a mix of others too around email messaging, interview feedback form, and feedback sessions. Really what I like to highlight is the importance of an ATS, which is a system of record to collect feedback, so that you have one source of truth. We use Greenhouse here at Namely. We love that the system makes it so easy for people outside of just the recruiting team to submit feedback and empower them to take an active role in the hiring process. And so I'll go into a few areas where bias can appear into the interview process. So the first one, interview team selection. This is where gender and racial biases can come up. So say on an interview panel, it's, you pick people to interview with candidates. It's pretty easy to overlook what types of people are actually comprising your interview panel. And if you actively try to make it a more diverse interview panel, it not only allows you to get a wide variety of perspectives, but it also helps make the candidate feel more comfortable. So say if you have a female engineer that is coming on site for an interview, they probably won't feel very comfortable with a panel of all men, right? And the same could be said for a group of interviewers that exclusively make up just a single racial group. Second, resume and profile review. This is where we see the racial and school bias appear. And so we like to refer to a stat by a Harvard Business School study where they found that 40% of Asian and African Americans whiten their resumes. And if you don't know what it means to whiten your resume, it's typically where people who might have a non-English sounding name will put an English sounding name so that it appeals more to whoever is reviewing the application. And then they might also take off culture associations or scholarships and instead add hobbies that are common in Western cultures like skiing, hiking, and kayaking. And so what they found is that this increases their chances of securing a first round interview by 20%. So it's just something to be mindful about when you're reviewing resumes. And then lastly, culture fit versus culture add. So as companies continue to strive for increased diversity and inclusion initiatives, the term culture fit is becoming less popular. In the past, culture fit has served as a sort of competitive advantage in the recruiting process. In more so recent years, culture fit has formulated into a negative connotation, representing people who think alike and act alike and work alike, which is the opposite of diversity. So therefore, the term culture fit can be a mask for bias. Something that we've been working on at Namely is moving away from this phrase, culture fit, and digging deeper into what makes a culture add. And this leads us into Namely and what we're doing. I mean, basically at Namely, we're not 100% there yet in defeating the whole notion of culture fit, but we're trying to mitigate the risk by anchoring in our culture values. And so we have 7 different values at Namely, and what we've done is define what it means to the company and training people on what it really means to have that value ingrained and then ask standardized questions around it. So right now we're in the middle of establishing cross-functional interviewers as culture add interviewers to focus specifically on our values. One of them, as an example, is unite around our mission. And so we've trained our interviewers to ask behavioral-based questions like, tell me about a time when you felt effective while working as part of a team, or tell me about a time when you've worked cross-departmentally to drive your company's mission forward. So really what we are trying to do is make sure that every interviewer is on the same page about what it means to Namely to unite around our mission and how we look for that quality in candidates. And so Nidhi, have you had similar situations at Hired around culture fit and culture add?
Yeah, absolutely, Maya. What great examples you provided. I especially like the term you've coined, beer bias. Definitely experienced that through the course of my career. I've had many a conversation with my engineers around that. At Hired, we have 5 core values, and we actually across the company, for any interview panel, we interview candidates to ensure that they're a values fit. So we call this a values fit interview. The way we orchestrate the values fit interview is there's a select group of individuals across the company who essentially volunteered and raised their hands to be part of this process. They've been trained on conducting the values fit interview. For the most part, these interviewees, when they go in to talk to a candidate, they are going in blind. The only thing they know of is the candidate's name and the role that they're interviewing for. They have not looked at their resume. They have not looked at their LinkedIn profiles. To give you a sense for some of the questions they ask for. So one of our values is set ambitious goals and drive towards results. So the questions that the interviewer asks in our values fit interview is to give us an example that demonstrates this value. It could be personal or professional at any time in their life, when they've set an ambitious goal for themselves and what they did to achieve that result. And anecdotes such as this are very helpful in helping us understand whether this candidate will be a values add for our organization or not. Ellen, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Yeah. So like Maya and Nidhi said, it's obviously very important to implement best practice with structured questions and structured interviewing should anything happen. And so with that, there are certain protected classes based on national, state, and local city laws. And in summary, you're not allowed to ask any questions that may reveal a candidate's protected class. So whether that's, religion or gender or age. And so just be sure when you are starting to implement structured questions that you research all the laws for all of your offices. And so what is it okay to ask? You can ask anything related to a candidate's ability to perform job duties. And so that includes any physical requirements of a job, such as, an ability to lift a certain amount of weight. So for example, at Namely, for our office coordinator position, one question that we're allowed to ask is, can you lift 20 pounds? Since it's an on-the-job requirement. It's also okay to ask for any non-medical qualifications and skills, such as certifications or licensees. And finally, it's also okay to ask applicants to describe or demonstrate how they would perform job tasks. And what's important to call out here is that all of these questions highlight the hard skills and competencies that are required of someone to be successful on the job. And so anchoring in these, one, protects yourself and your team legally, but it, of course, also mitigates unconscious bias.
Great. So now that Ellen's gone over what's okay to ask, really what's not okay to ask is, is important as well, right? So really, if you look at the slide, there's what you want to look out for is questions that may reveal a protected class. So if it's disclosed, don't take it into account when making a hiring decision or recommendation. And these protected classes include anyone over the age of 40, disability, genetic information, national origin, pregnancy, race, color, religion, sex, anything related to gender or gender identity or sexual orientation. So, for example, questions like, do you celebrate Christmas? Might not seem like a very harmful question, but it could reveal a protected class of religion. Right. So something to, think about, especially when you're approaching the holidays. Same with starting a family or having a baby, that reveals pregnancy. So you can't take that into account for a hiring decision. And then this one I think is really easy to kind of overlook. Which bathroom do you use? That could reveal gender identity. I know when candidates come on site, they'll frequently ask us, could we use the bathroom, especially if they've been on site for 3 to 4 hours. So something to just be aware of, when you do, when candidates come and ask you these types of questions and how to address them. And salary history is something that obviously you can't ask about, and Ellen will go into this a little bit further.
Yeah, so even if you, of course, don't ask any of those questions that Maya just referenced, it's still possible for a candidate to disclose unnecessary information. And so what do you do if a candidate does disclose unnecessary information? Number one, ignore it, but also at Namely, we say be human. So if someone says, I'm getting married next week, don't just ignore them, say congrats, and then change the subject. And then also don't write it down anywhere. Don't tell anyone, and definitely don't, like Maya said, take it into any hiring decision. The only exception we have for this at Namely is with current salary. And so if an interviewer is disclosed salary, we actually have in our ATS a section that's private where the interviewer writes down the salary. And they write it specifically saying candidate voluntarily disclosed salary. And that's just to protect ourselves. And so I think that's super important, like Maya said, to get an ATS or a system in place where interviewers can write down notes that you can reference at a later time. But again, any other unnecessary information, such as a candidate's protected class, shouldn't be taken into account in a hiring decision. And obviously this is easier said than done, which is why it's so important to understand your biases and truly be aware of how your biases differ from someone else's.
So this one we've covered how bias manifests itself during the interview process. Let's talk about what happens at the salary and offer stage. Before we go exploring into bias at this stage of the process, let's do a quick poll. Have you ever heard of someone being paid less than a peer of another gender in the same role? And while I wait for you to vote and for those results to come in, what I'm going to cover in the next section is share some of the data that we've collected. So every year, based on the data we collect at Hired, we study the data and we publish an annual State of Wage Inequalities report. We just finished publishing that report a month ago. This year was our third year publishing this report. And today I'd like to share some of our findings with you. So let's look at the results of the poll. So 81% of you overwhelmingly say that you've heard of someone being paid less. Well, not great, but this is commensurate with the results that we found in our study. So wage gap is a big issue. We conducted a similar survey when we did our study, and over 50% of women surveyed reported that they had found that they themselves were paid less than a peer of another gender. 54% of the women said that they knew that they were paid less for the same role. On the other hand, only 19% of men reported experiencing this throughout their career. So this also explains why 21% more women than men believe that their gender identity affects their salary. Companies share a part of this blame. We found that 63% of the time, men are offered higher salaries than women for the same role at the same company. I think it's really important to understand this number because the way our study works is we study the exact same role at the exact same company. In studying the exact same role at the exact same company, 63% of the time, men are offered higher salaries than women. On average, women are offered about 4% less than men, with some companies offering up to 45% less. What is most disheartening about these numbers is that they haven't budged since our 2017 report. So we're not affecting a change in our industry fast enough. It's also important to note that wage inequality goes beyond gender. Factors such as race, LGBTQ+ status, and age can affect salaries and expectations. However, companies don't share all of the blame. We need to also empower our female candidates. 66% of the time, we as women are asking for less money. So why is it that we're hearing so much about the salary history ban recently? Because it helps in combating this exact wage disparity. Women ask for less 66% of the time, and they get less. And typically when they ask for less, they ask for about 6% less on average. Since 66% of the time, women are asking for less money and are getting paid less, if we continue to base their current salary or future salary based on their past history salary, it'll continue to perpetuate the same bias that exists today. We've also found that women often undervalue their accomplishments. So we believe that undervaluing their accomplishments may be one of the reasons why women don't ask for what they're worth. 50% of the female survey respondents said that they frequently experience imposter syndrome, and perhaps that's the reason why they undervalue their worth. Why should companies care? So we've talked about, companies sharing part of the blame. We need to empower our female candidates. Why should a company care about this? A company should care about this because it's not only right thing to do, but it's also right for your business. Hired found that 75% of candidates indicated that their interest in working in an organization would be impacted if the company received negative attention for having a gender wage gap. We believe that this mindset will bring a seismic change to wage disparities that we see in our industry today. Candidates and employees will force companies to focus on this issue and do the right thing. Empirical evidence shows that diverse teams perform better. There are many studies that have been published over the years. University of Maryland found that greater diversity is linked with better managerial task and firm performance. According to a study published by Credit Suisse Research Institute, increased diversity on corporate boards leads to higher returns on equity, higher valuations, and better stock performance. So let's talk about how you can solve the problem at your company. There's a few key steps to be mindful of when it comes to avoiding bias at this stage of the process. Establish a compensation philosophy. 2, collect and look at the data on a regular basis. 3, commit to pay equality. 4th, don't stop making it a priority. And lastly, communicate your results widely. So let's go deeper into each one of these. Establishing a compensation philosophy. So we'll talk about how we at Hired, what we at Hired did at each of these stages. In establishing a compensation philosophy at Hired, the process end to end took about 8 months. Between countless Google Docs, emails, dozens of meetings with cross-functional leaders, building career paths, hours of poring over independent market salary data, including the data we see on our platform, and time well spent with outside advisors, we finally built a compensation structure that rewards performance, but at the same time, championing fair pay. Second, collect and look at the data. Once our compensation framework was in place, we tested it. You never get it right the first time around. After identifying where wage gaps existed, it was necessary to determine whether or not gaps were justified. For example, one team member may have more years of experience and have a better performance record than their peers. So technically their salary should be more. We found that many of our wage gaps were justified, but many were not. We calibrated this across every single team member in our organization. Step 3, commit to pay equality. Following our initial assessment in 2016, we had a transparent conversation with the entire team to explain what our new compensation framework meant for them, what we found when we examined everyone's salaries, and what changes we were making to close the gap. This was a hard conversation because it required us to be vulnerable about our past inequalities, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. Our team took pride knowing that they work for an organization that champions wage equality and values transparency, even when things aren't that rosy. Step 4, since 2016, we haven't stopped making it a priority. Wage gaps have a sneaky way of creeping back into the organization, especially in fast-paced competitive industries like high tech, fast-growing companies like Hired. To ensure this doesn't happen at Hired, we review salary every 6 months and approve incoming offers very, very carefully to make sure that we're not introducing disparities across the organization. Lastly, step 5, communicate your results widely. Our goal is to build trust with our employees that everyone will always be treated in a consistent, unbiased manner. We publish our internal wage and diversity numbers, and we encourage all companies to do the same. We recognize that publicly reporting our wage and diversity numbers is not an accomplishment, but one small step towards creating a culture of authentic diversity, equity, and inclusion. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Maya.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nidhi. Yeah, so now that you've all heard of ways to combat the wage gap, we can now think about how to combat bias by empowering your employees. So I assume that a majority of you in the audience that are listening to this webinar are HR professionals and that you clearly have an interest in this topic, and that's why you're here. And so at Namely, we're also really passionate about this topic and how it affects our hiring practices, but we struggled a lot with spreading the awareness and importance of it to the rest of our organization. We can continue to preach about it, but they won't fully understand or care about it until they see firsthand what their direct actions have on the hiring process. And so this is where we realized that the educational piece was so important, and we decided to roll out a comprehensive interview training certification program, like I mentioned earlier. So I'll pause again, and we'll do another quick poll. Is it pulled up? Okay, we'll just keep going. But yeah, if we go to the next slide, we'll go through some of what we covered in the training program. So these are 3 guiding principles that we wanted to use as a theme throughout our training courses to ensure that our employees understand the purpose of training. Candidates want an objective and fair evaluation of their skills and report it as a contributing factor to a positive candidate experience. So that's one of them, creating a really great positive candidate experience. And training really helps do that. It also helps with mitigating bias and risk from a legal perspective, like we've talked about earlier. And then lastly, training everyone to submit quality feedback allows us to use data as a basis for our hiring decisions and look into areas for improvement in the interview process.
Yeah, so to share a bit more about the interviewer training that Maya and I developed, here's a quick outline. So first we had Recruiting 101, which was an e-learning to train all interviewers on our ATS. And foundationally, people needed to understand the system we were using before they understood our actual process or learned best practice interview techniques. And then we had Recruiting 201, which was an in-person overview of process, feedback, those legal do's and don'ts, as well as unconscious bias. And at this point, we've trained over 200 people across our 5 offices in 101 and 201. But in the future, we want 201 to be more of an e-learning for scalability. And finally, there's 301, which, full disclosure, it's still in the development phase. We foresee it being as a training anchoring in the STAR method to help teach our interviewers how to thoughtfully evaluate skills, competencies, and our company values. And at the end of these trainings, each interviewer will certify in front of a panel. And obviously, this is a lengthy program, but like Maya mentioned, communicating the importance of the program for mitigating risk, improving candidate experience, and making data-driven decisions helps get buy-in from the company. And beyond interviewer training, there's also some quicker wins or low-hanging fruit that you can implement throughout the hiring process to remove bias or mitigate bias from your hiring process. So first, there's blind resume review, which removes names, schools, companies, and even those hobbies and interests we may subconsciously be taking into account during resume review. And this forces us really to look at the candidate's skills, which in the end is actually going to be what predicts on the job success. Another thing that you can do that we did here at Namely was we audited all job descriptions to ensure that each job description has gender neutral language. So for example, such words and phrases as ninja can be masculine skewed. And it's important to remove these words from your job descriptions to make sure that you're getting a wide variety of candidates. And if you do use those words, just make sure that they're offset with more feminine skewed words or phrases. And finally, you can also implement a value system. The solution obviously isn't to pretend that culture fit doesn't exist, but instead defining what your company culture is and the values that make up that culture. And so by defining those values, you can, in a very structured way, empower employees with interviewer questions that they can really anchor in to evaluate values, whether it's on a phone screen or an on-site interview.
Great. So as a hiring manager with a technical background, I want to give a few tips around, some of the conversations that I have with my hiring managers in terms of how to continue to maintain the efficiencies that we're used to, but at the same time, remove bias through the process. So I believe that in addition to the efforts of your internal recruiting teams and HR teams, hiring managers should be practicing these tips to mitigate bias. These tips are primarily focused at the technical hiring manager, but they can be used broadly in various roles across operations, data science, product management, as well as design. So first, broaden your search. We as humans tend to gravitate towards people who are like us. Many companies have referrals as their primary channel of hiring. If you have a team full of men, most likely their networks will be just full of men, and you'll continue to hire just men at your company. Look beyond your immediate network. Broaden your search. There's plenty of tools available out there for you to do that. Second, we talked about this earlier, ignore pedigree, especially school and company. And I know why hiring managers do this. I used to do this many years ago. It creates efficiencies. If you know that somebody's graduated from MIT or somebody's worked at Google, they are more than likely to pass your interview process. But think about that. If you continue to focus and interview somebody who studied at MIT or who worked at Google, you continue to bias yourself towards people who were fortunate enough in their lives to make their way there. The way we've combated this and the way we've tried to overcome this is by focusing on the work history of the candidate as opposed to their pedigree. So when we look at the work history of the candidate, we look at the work that they've done, what impact it has made to the organization, and that helps us decide if this is a candidate worth talking to. We previously talked about assigning competencies and documenting them in your ATS. Debrief is very important. So prior to the debrief, make sure that everybody's feedback makes it into the ATS system. And during candidate debrief, it is very easy for the conversation to go astray. And before you know it, you'll be facing a beer bias. So during the candidate debrief, focus on assigned competencies and scores. Make sure that when an interviewer is providing feedback, they are providing feedback based on the canned set of questions that they were asked to ask the candidate. Fourth, technical interviews. Technical interviews are incredibly important. And I think in our industry today, this is one of the biggest areas where we need to make significant improvements to make sure that they are fair to all candidates. Let's start with coding. All of us as hiring managers want candidates to do coding during the interview process. There's nothing wrong with coding. We do coding exercises as well. But whiteboard coding is very uncomfortable for a very large group of candidates. Avoid whiteboard coding. And the way you accomplish and do coding interviews is make it seem as natural to the candidate as it is to working at your company. Think about this for a second. How many times do you have an engineer at your company walk up to a whiteboard, be given a problem, and they start coding? Not pseudocode, not design, actual physical code. It hardly ever happens. So you want to mimic during the coding interview, you want to make the process seem as natural as it would be. So the way we structure them is typically the candidate and the interviewer are sitting on the same side of the table. There's banter as if they are pair programming. They are encouraged to ask questions. We even allow Google searches because these days a lot of the syntax we often, do Google searches, so we allow all of that, and that's okay. We do a whiteboard exercise, but it's primarily from a design standpoint, but not from a coding standpoint. Let's talk about some of the questions that are asked during the technical interview. Usually, asking them to code up a game is very common. We do the same thing. We ask candidates to code Battleship. If my hiring managers are listening to this, they're going to probably be cursing me because I'm really revealing this. When we ask a candidate to code Battleship, if I were doing that question, I come from India, I never played the game of Battleship. So it'll probably take me 10 minutes to grok the problem to begin with. And if there's an hour allocated for the interview, I start at an automatic disadvantage by me getting 50 minutes, whereas the other candidates who are familiar with Battleship, they get an hour. You accommodate people such as me by either offering me a menu of games to pick from, or you give me an extra 10 minutes to make the interview equitable. Lastly, set expectations. There is no reason to surprise a candidate. No interview should be a gotcha interview. You should not have gotcha questions. Why? You really want these candidates to be successful? What's the point of having gotcha questions? Set expectations with the candidate before they come to the office. Explain to them what the interview process would look like, what they would go through, and if they request, make reasonable accommodations when needed. One candidate, when we set expectations that we were going to have them code, so they should bring their laptops with them, one candidate reached out to me and said he was not comfortable coding in an interview setting. It seemed like a really reasonable ask. We still wanted to see his code. So what we asked him to do is write the code, solve the problem offline in the comfort of his home or cafe or whatever he preferred, and just to time box the time that he took to solve the problem, send us back the code along with the time it took, and that's how we evaluated him. So this is where HR and technical managers should partner with each other and have a deep understanding of where and how they may be biasing against certain groups, and make sure that the process is stripped of some of those issues, and you're constantly and continually looking at your interview practices and making sure that you're avoiding bias. Handing over to you, Maya.
So yeah, we've gone over a lot today, and in terms of like different ways to combat bias, but really if you want to think about what you can do right now, is question your first impression. An interview training program is pretty lengthy, but when you want to question your first impression, that's how you can combat bias. So say if you have a candidate come on site, or even on a phone interview, you know in the first minute that they're an absolute no. Think about spending the next 29 minutes or however long you have in the actual interview to figure out why you're a no, and see if you can convince yourself that in ways to determine that they're not actually a no. So that's one thing that you can do to try to combat bias and combat your initial first mental kind of decision shortcut making. And so I guess that concludes our presentation. I'll pass this over back to Alex.
Great. Thank you all. Just seeing the thoughtful questions come through. It was fantastic content, and I think we'll get to some of those questions in just a minute. Being from Namely, I just wanted to touch on what we do here for less than 60 seconds. As many of you probably know, Namely is an all-in-one HR, payroll, and benefits platform created to help mid-sized companies build a better workplace. I think based on who's in the room today, we have a lot of talent acquisition / HR hybrid professionals. Something that's really important is for you guys is time to fill, but something to think about from Namely's perspective is how long does that person take to actually start contributing with Namely. We streamline the onboarding process and reduce paperwork. we've seen people, HR professionals, save up to 11 hours a week just through our onboarding process alone. One of them actually ended up taking Fridays off because they have so much less paperwork. So that's what Namely does, and you'll have the opportunity to request a demo after the slide.
Thank you, Alex. So let me talk about a little bit more about Hired. Hired offers robust candidate profiles, DE&I features, and intelligent matching that helps your company avoid bias and create a more predictable candidate pipeline. We have candidate response rates of over 90%, positive response rates of over 65%. So you can spend less time connecting and more time having productive conversations with qualified technical talent. So if you haven't checked out Hired yet, please do. You may end up taking Thursdays off in addition to your Fridays off.
That's awesome. So I'll launch a quick poll while we jump into Q&A for any of you folks interested in getting a demo of either Hired or Namely. And if you did ask any questions, please be sure to surface those. Again, we had a lot of them rolling through. So jump in the Q&A, and if you really wanted to get something answered, feel free to ask again. And with that, I think we'll leave the poll up, but we can jump right into Q&A. Does that sound good? Cool. So the first question I have is actually for Ellen. Sarah asks, how would you suggest measuring unconscious bias in the interview process?
So I think the big thing to call it here is that you can't measure unconscious bias. But one thing that you can do is, not just look at the diversity of the hires that you've made, but also what does diversity look like throughout your pipeline? And so ask yourself and use data, and this is when the ATS is key. But does a certain demographic drop off at certain points in your process, or does a certain demographic drop off at certain points with a certain hiring manager? And it's really key to look into those and hold people accountable, which is why in turn unconscious bias training is so important, and understanding your own biases and how they can be at play are equally as important. But if anyone has the answer to measuring unconscious bias itself, let us know.
Perfect. So I'll follow up with a question for Nidhi that came in. If my organization has previously received negative attention for a wage gap that we are currently combating, how do you suggest bouncing back from the issue?
Oh, what a great question. Look, if your organization has gone through that, you're not alone. This is an issue that all of us are grappling with, and all of us will grapple with at some point in time. My advice would be authentic, be transparent, and openly have these discussions. We did the same thing back in 2016. These conversations will be uncomfortable, and it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to have these uncomfortable conversations. And guess what? This is just the beginning of the process. This is not a one-time exercise. It's a continual exercise. So if you can be authentic and transparent with your employees and with your consumers, you'll go a long way and you'll increase your rate of success.
Great. Thanks, Nidhi. And I just want to send a reminder out for those of you who are still on the webinar. After we answer a couple questions here, we will distribute the SHRM credit with about 5 minutes to go. So just hang tight while we answer a couple of these thoughtful questions that came in. The next one I have here is for Maya. Maya, what are the hardest parts to solve for bias in the hiring process? What low-hanging fruit would you start with first?
Sure, I think that's a great question. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but for me, I think education is really the most difficult part. And developing a training program it's a pretty lengthy process. Like at Namely, it took us 3 to 4 months to develop it, and then rolling it out was a whole different story as well. So it's hard work, but I think it's extremely important. And I think another thing that's also difficult is changing your recruiting process to involve more structured interviewing and technical assessments. This allows you to have a more objective interview process and have less subjective reasoning, I suppose. And so I guess when you want to think about low-hanging fruit, we've talked about these a little bit earlier as well, but the job description audit, I think that's a really easy win. Textio, I believe, even has like a free trial if you want to check it out. But yeah, if they'll help you look at for gender neutral words that you can use in the job description, it's very easy, so I'd recommend that. Secondly, interview panel and lineup, doing an audit of this so that it does include diverse team members to represent your company. I think that's important. But then also when you're debriefing, those team members will be able to have diverse perspectives and opinions to share on those candidates. So that's a pretty easy win as well. And then actually, I think Ellen maybe could share a little bit more about something that we recently implemented, which is really cool.
Yeah. So when Maya says recently, she literally means this morning. So something that we just did this morning was we added preferred pronouns to our job application. And so now candidates, when they apply to a role at Namely, they can, it's an optional field, they can fill out their preferred pronouns. And so it's our hope that that will help, show applicants who aren't familiar with Namely or familiar with our culture, that we are a culture that values diversity and coming to work as your authentic self. And so adding that to your job description is something that's so easy. It took me 5 minutes, and we're really hoping that it'll make an impact, but I'll keep you updated.
Great. So I'm going to send it back over to Nidhi for the next one. And I think this is like a common theme that we saw throughout a lot of questions, but this is a more generic version. What's the best way to get my company execs focused on the importance of bias?
Oh God, I hear this question so much from HR professionals and TAs. Look, there are so many studies that have been published. We've just walked through a big set of data as to why you as a company should care about this issue. Download our State of Wage Inequality report. Show them the data. Once you show them the data, have a conversation about the values of the company that you're at and why this is an important issue, and align this issue and the resolve to solve it with the values of the company. I think once you show them how it impacts the business, and that's the reason why some of this data has been published, and that's the reason why there are so many studies like the Harvard Business Review study, it just makes business sense. It's not just the right thing to do, it just makes business sense. If every company is looking to grow from a business standpoint as well as from an employee standpoint, if 75% of the candidates will lose interest in working at a company, then you're not going to be able to hire or retain employees. But I think the onus is also on us as hiring managers and recruiters, because an exec will automatically think, oh my God, if I do this and if I have to diversify my recruiting pipeline, it's going to slow it down. That's a first question that they think of. So as a recruiter, once you've aligned the values, also build the muscle to figure out how you're going to diversify the pipeline. You cannot have a conversation with an exec and say, we need to diversify our workforce, but oh, by the way, it's going to take me triple the time to fill every rec. That just doesn't fly. So while you're having the conversation, figure out how you're going to fix your processes and fix your processes, figure out how you're going to broaden your search and build that muscle of how to broaden the search. And then you can actually service the business at the same time as building a diverse and equitable company. And last but not the least, you need to, this is not a one-time conversation. You need to continually revisit this conversation. Establish goals that are achievable, that don't get in the way of the business and are achievable. And every few months, continue to build that partnership, continue to have that conversation, continue to measure the goals that you set out for yourself, and make those goals increasingly more aggressive. So an example of those goals could be, you may start by setting a goal of, let's look at our interview process and let's talk about it a month from now. Then the following month, have a conversation about reviewing your wage gap data and establishing a compensation philosophy. Once you've done all of that, then establish a goal of, for every role at the company, you're going to do X number of reach outs to diverse candidates. Once you've gone through that, then you can actually change your goal to go deeper into the funnel of X number of candidates at the TPS stage or X number of candidates at on-site. So go deeper and make incremental progress as opposed to, just trying to tackle everything at the same time.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think we have a follow-up question that makes sense for you to touch on now, Nidhi. How can recruiting team members best engage with hiring managers to help?
Right. I mean, I think it's a really deep partnership. So the way I've solved for that in my organization is hiring and filling the recs are not just the goal and the responsibility of